our next speaker is the previous speaker, which is Aleksandar, and he will tell us more. If you read the title of his presentation, it might sound a little strange. He's going to talk about, well, what about, so he showed you one way of creating what you might call a cloud-optimized version of HDF5 files, but that's not the only way. And he will tell you something about another way of achieving a similar goal. Take it away.
Yeah, sure. So hear me again. Hopefully I'll speak slower this time. So when Hug meeting was announced, I thought there might be some or since someone mentioned there'll be a opportunity for sort of panel discussion and things, and I thought this would be a topic that might be interesting or at least relevant to wider HDF5 user community. But then we came back to this 15-minute talks. So I don't think it's still easy to do something useful here. And so my slides are not really meant to deliver something or some huge conclusion or some technical result. This is more to spark discussion, and hopefully because of my slides now, I'll ruin your dinner and you'll have to talk about this issue, but not something more interesting maybe or more important to you. So I apologize in advance. So I feel for a number of months that like we are at the time where I think these questions should be posed, and to some degree it is maybe internal strategic HDF group question, but I also think that it involves the HDF5 users, and I thought let's at least ask it now at this meeting and see what happens. But at least we can check off, say yes, we did it, we asked, and we can proceed whatever is the decision. So I talked about Zarr to more detail at the last year's European Hug meeting, so I don't have time now to go through all of these things. And so, as my colleague John also mentioned, Zarr is in many ways exactly the same purpose as HDF5. It's a generic multidimensional array data format. The only difference is that right now, no one in the Zarr community thinks of Zarr files and talks of Zarr files. That's not what they're targeting. So in that way, there's a huge difference between Zarr community and HDF community. But Zarr turned out to be extremely suitable for all kinds of storage systems that in some way or another expose a key value interface. So you can assume POSIX file system is one to some degree, or relational database, or a bunch of key value stores, data stores that are available now, or obviously cloud object stores. And that's what really helped Zarr to take off. When the cloud computing and cloud native computing, cloud computing without file systems really became a thing. Zarr, obviously because HDF5 exists and people are aware of HDF5, so it inspired a lot of ideas in Zarr. Supports what I call holy trinity in all data cube storage features. That's hierarchies or groups, or someone called it directories, chunking and chunk compression. So it kind of covers a lot already. It's very appealing because it's a very simple specification. As I said, they don't talk about files, and once you give up creating files, a lot of technical problems and questions go away. And so at the core of Zarr is really naming scheme for keys. And if you imagine HDF5 file and all the little structures and parts that go into that HDF5 file, you would have an independent, unique key in Zarr for that data or that information. And so these keys are pre-computable, if that's the word. In other words, once you know what you want or where the data should go, you know the key from which to read the data or to write the data. And so parallelization is trivial because there is no anymore a central authority that needs to bless something. You just know how to compute the keys, and it's only a matter of orchestrating processes not to work on the same keys kind of thing. When I talked last year, there was a version 2. This year, maybe a few months back, there is a version 3 of Zarr. specification, and it's very formal, much more formalized than the previous one. So I think it's going to stick around for a longer time. And I think that's why I wanted to bring this to this meeting and raise awareness of this. And one big part of Zarr version 3 is idea of extending it through extension. In other words, the core is very conservative, very basic. And the idea is that everything else is a Zarr extension, and therefore any software, and that's what Zarr community emphasizes, they don't want to have a single software implementation. Every software implementation is free to support any of the Zarr extensions. But if it encounters an unknown extension, it should not fail. It should proceed for as long as possible. And so because of that extensibility of Zarr v3, I thought, all right, so maybe we should now look at Zarr in a different way. So how is Zarr and HSDS schema? As I said, HSDS schema is essentially what is the data format of HSDS service. It's very conceptually similar to Zarr in terms of how it comes to storing the data. It did originate from HDF5 JSON, which was a JSON representation of HDF5 file. So it's a very closely aligned with HDF5 file features. So that's positive in HSDS's case. But the HSDS schema is not really publicized by the company. I mean, I don't think that a lot of people are aware of it. It's really sort of like a, behind the curtain, and what's up front is HSDS service. So the question that I have is, can Zarr v3 and its extensions, future and the current ones, be used as the cloud storage for the HDF5 data model? And the key thing here is HDF5 data model, which means that I'm not talking about one-to-one mapping between HDF5 files and whatever would be able to be stored in cloud HDF5. The data would still be there and the data would be correct, but some other storage features that accumulated over time in HDF5 files may not be applicable to cloud storage or may not simply be possible in this way. So that's why I'm thinking we need to discuss this. So in a very unscientific way, I try to explain, so what are the pros and cons, but before that, I'm just going to mention the main differences between Zarr v3 right now and HDF5 data model. So the biggest hurdle right out of the gate is that in Zarr, because of the requirements that keys are unique, there cannot be multiple linking like in HDF5 data model. Multiple linking or multiple path names, but basically to name HDF5 groups or HDF5 datasets in multiple names. That's not possible in Zarr, not in the core specification. The other obvious missing part is no object and region reference data type. The Zarr specification is actually very conservative. They cover only the most basic numerical and string data types, not even variable length data. So there is room to improve, but right now there is no such a thing. As far as Zarr attributes and their data types, situation is very fluid, I would say, or very, very relaxed. So they don't worry about data types of Zarr attributes. They're essentially JSON data types. And so if your application can make work with it, awesome. If it cannot, well, you try to cast it into the data type you need, and if it works, great. If it's not, well, see what you can do about it. In terms of attribute values, they are really any type of JSON literal, which is kind of exactly the same case for HSDS schema right now. Although HSDS schema is much more specific and aligned with HDF5 data types. So every HDF5 attribute in HSDS schema has a data type. So what are the pros and cons? Again, it is very unscientific, and I don't want to go into was I right or not. I'm just asking people to really say what they think about, because that's really what matters. So for me, the question is the world, the greater data scientific world really served having both HSDS schema and Zarr? Or one, we can save the world with one format. So that's the question I think we need to all think about. This would also mean that HDF software would become a part of a larger data ecosystem. Right now, as far as I know, HDF5 library only reads and creates HDF5 files. I have not heard of anyone writing an HDF5 reader for some other data format. So this would basically mean that HDF software would create Zarr and be able to read Zarr. So that's, obviously part of a larger ecosystem. And the benefit will also be that Zarr is now being taken up by a number of communities and people because it's easy to understand and easy to implement. And so I'd expect that the number of Zarr-based software greatly outnumbers the number of HDF-based software. So that software may be able to benefit from Zarr-created data from HDF software in a way that may not be possible right now because HSDS schema would be foreign to them. So that's pros. The cons, obviously, it's for the current users or producers of HDF5 files, not really having one-to-one mapping with HDF5 file features may not be really attractive, or maybe a non-starter. So that's something to obviously be aware of and acknowledge. The whole Zarr extension proposal process is very new. There are very few of them. I don't know how much life there will be in these proposals, how much time it takes for extension to get through the proposal process. The current proposals are done by people who are, let's say, the leaders in the Zarr community. So expectations is those things will go through. But let's say if someone comes from the left field, what kind of treatment would those proposals do? It's unknown. I don't know. Still too early to tell. And also, I think culturally for HDF Group as a company, this is kind of a different situation because right now, HDF Group really is in full control of HDF5 file format, what goes into the library, everything. If we want to go this route, obviously we now have to, I don't want to use the negotiate, but we definitely have to be in the community that may not have so direct vested interest in HDF as HDF Group has. And that's all I have as far as the slides. I'm really interested if people have some thoughts or some comments to what I said. But other than that, I save you some time and you can go to lunch or dinner quicker. So I'm done. Yeah, the usual goodness of a nonprofit HDF Group. And thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Let's see. But there are some questions. Hold on.
You can't see it. No, I mean, the obvious suggestion here would be that it writers are vault connected. Fine, it reads in potentially writers are.
I can't hear well.
Oh.
There's a lot of echo. I can't hear.
Let's see.
I can come yell at your computer.
I'll come.
Alexander, you hear me?
Excellent.
Back again? Okay. So the obvious solution I was suggesting was write a Zarr vault connector. Then you can access all the Zarr data produced by the Zarr community and still have the HDF5 ecosystem as the front end in a sense. Easy to do.
No, I agree. That's an option. The one question that I don't have is why should I use HDF just to read? I want to create my Zarr data as well. So why should I?
You could create whatever. It's fine. You could write it as fully featured as you want. Not necessarily you, but someone could write a Zarr connector that was very fully featured. It's just going to bonk occasionally when you pick a feature that isn't supported by Zarr and say, sorry, no, I can't do that. But I think that's the world. That's fine. I know, yeah, which is pretty straightforward and it's not terrible. And
so I have a question for the vol approach. So basically, because in the case of Zarr or anything else, so there is the Zarr part, but then there is access to various places that can store Zarr.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, you would have to have a vol for Zarr only, and then that vol would have to talk to another vol, which is more storage system oriented. That's possible, I assume.
You can layer vol connectors to your heart's desire, sure. Yeah.
Because I would not like to have a Zarr vol for S3 and there's Zarr vol for Google Cloud and then Zarr vol for file system.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, you should just be able to stack the one thing that understands Zarr on top of things that understand storage systems. And that would be a pass-through on top of a terminal, very normal.
Yeah, then I call the community to huddle, and so I'm calling upon the HDF5 community to huddle together and produce a Zarr vol.
There you go.
Or,
okay. In my spare time, sure. Yeah, no, I got other things for spare time, but it's a good idea.
I feel like those underlying vols would be a little weird because they would only be doing Zarr implementation stuff. So
Yeah.
you'd have like a Zarr vol connector, and then you would have some sort of different plugin stuff underneath. I feel like it'd be difficult to layer that on top of another vol connector. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's my ignorance of the Zarr format, but it seems like that would be an odd match.
Yeah, it might be. You could just create a new thing that was Zarr vol connector plugins, right? And then you choose the one you wanted to do, S3 or Google or whatever.
Could you have the equivalent of like a VFD for this vol that would say write to S3 or POSIX or Google?
Right, sure.
Right.
I mean, there might be a way of doing it in kind of in a way for which the vol was never intended, really. But maybe you could rip off like the data set write operations to dump stuff in. I don't know. It would be, but I feel like that would be challenging because it would want to do its own thing. Like if you had like an S3 vol connector, or if you had a Deos vol connector, they're going to have their own ideas about how stuff is stored. It's not just going to be for arbitrarily scribbling bytes into a range or something like that.
Yeah, it would be better to have the vol connector there on top of some Zarr ecosystem that understood Zarr stuff and could translate it out into storage layers.
Right.
Well, it's not my problem though.
Aleksandar, I recall like Unidata was working on a C library for Zarr. How is that going? I haven't heard much about it recently.
That's actually a good point that you bring up, because if you go back and we talk about history here, NetCDF developers have a good track record of recognizing up and coming promising data forms. So back in the day, they chose HDF5 or NetCDF4. And now, a few years back, they decided to also have independent interface for Zarr. And I think it's called ANSI Zarr. So I think that's another data point that I took into account when I thought about this whole thing. Yes, when we tried it last time, which was, I think, December, January, for one sort of project for NASA, it didn't really work that well. It couldn't deal with some NASA data that we converted to Zarr and this kind of thing. But they're working on it, I think, and there is, as I said, there is interest, especially geoscience community, for Zarr. And so I expect it to get better. Now, whether or not they would benefit from Zarr vol, and would be wise for us to talk with NetCDF folks to see if they would be also interested to contribute to Zarr vol. That would be an interesting angle. But yes, they already done that to some degree. I don't know if there's any NetCDF people in the crowd there. They can maybe correct me. I don't want to, misrepresent anything regarding NetCDF library.
Sure. So, do you hear me next time?
You have to.
Okay, let me go up there. Yeah, Aleksandar. So as kind of referenced before, my institute and myself, I'm slightly involved in both talking to the HDF Group, but also talking to the Zarr community, because at least part of the Zarr specification originated from my institute. I, and so yeah, there's several interesting points here. So one is the question of governance of Zarr, and it's still a little bit amorphous, it's evolving, but for the most part, the main governing body of Zarr is actually the so-called implementation council. So effectively, actually, if you do implement a wall connector, you could essentially have a seat at that council because you are now implementer of Zarr. So that's one interesting consequence of that proposal. And I think the other thing that I've noticed in talking to people is that everyone seems to want to have maybe a single library or API to access everything. But the thing I've noticed is that no one can quite agree on what that API should be. For example, my institute has this thing called N5, which I mentioned is called, is tongue-in-cheek, not HDF5. But there's actually an N5 HDF5 connector. It basically has a HDF5 backend, and now there's a Zarr backend to this. And, and so there's some thought that, okay, for that particular community, that's the API they want, but I pointed out this to them that it could go the other way. HDF5 that as an API could be the one API to connect to everything. And I've also heard from some of the Zarr folks that, okay, maybe they want their particular Zarr variant to be the one API that could possibly read HDF5 or a subset of HDF5. And so I think I see this going all the way around. It's not super clear. From the developer's perspective, though, my sense is that people are more wedded to APIs than formats. And so if you could basically make it work with the existing API, they don't have to change much of the software, I think that's, they would appreciate that.
No, I agree. I mean, APIs are actually what brings all these data formats into reality. I mean, as much as reality digital world is. But yes, I mean, software makes things possible. The data formats, yeah. They are just one add-on. Yes, since you mentioned this implementation council, I think there is another one above them, which is steering council. And so now that you mentioned, I remember. So as far as the extension proposal goes, I think everyone on Zarr steering council has to say yes to every extension proposal, but majority is required in the implementation council for some extensions to be accepted or not. So that's another data point. But no, I mean, you're right. APIs are what matters. And my also experience from work where I work, whenever you have a bunch of data formats that are supported or supposed to be supported by some application, there is always an abstraction layer that comes on top of that. And I don't know if that's the law of nature, but I always notice that the data format with the least features always wins over. So all the other data formats with more features are kind of dumped down towards the data format with least features in order to support this abstraction layer. And so that's where I think that usefulness of HDF5 API and all these features and possibilities would benefit if HDF5 API would become more useful than just for HDF5 files or the HSDS schema or that kind of thing. And Vol, Zarr Vol is definitely the right approach. Only, how to motivate people to program in C.